There are souls in London who claim to have heard the divine. Men who, in their grief or guilt, believe the heavens themselves have stooped to whisper in their ear. Of all the strange chronicles I have penned of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, none lingers in my mind quite like the adventure of the man who spoke to angels, a case where the celestial met the criminal, and faith itself was used as a weapon. It began in those bleak weeks before Christmas, when the city's spires vanished into a low-hanging pall of smoke and fog, and even Baker Street seemed to dream in shades of grey. Our visitor that morning was a banker of spotless reputation, a man who swore that voices, sweet and unearthly, had called his name in the darkness of a London church. They bade him repent, and to give away his fortune to those who claimed to speak for heaven. Yet beneath the perfume of incense and the glow of candlelight, Holmes caught the stench of fraud. What began as a whisper of wings would lead us into a labyrinth of spiritual deceit, secret passages, and a scheme so blasphemous that even the most hardened skeptic might have crossed himself. Here, logic would do battle with illusion, and where others saw angels, Holmes saw only the handiwork of men, clever, merciless, and masked in the radiance of faith. This, then, is the case I record as The Adventure of the Man Who Spoke to Angels. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Timekeeper's Testament. The autumn of 1889 brought with it a peculiar melancholy to London, as though the very stones of Baker Street had absorbed the grey resignation of the season. I found myself that October morning seated across from my friend Sherlock Holmes, who was absorbed in what appeared to be a most singular experiment. 3 pocket watches lay dissected upon our breakfast table, their innards exposed like the anatomical studies I had pursued in my medical days, whilst Holmes peered at them through his lens with the intensity of a man reading ancient scripture. "You observe, Watson," said he, without lifting his eyes from a particularly intricate spring mechanism, "that the balance wheel of a Swiss timepiece oscillates at a frequency quite distinct from its English counterpart. The continental craftsman favours precision over durability, whilst our own horologists— but I bore you." "Not at all, Holmes," I protested, though in truth my attention had wandered to the grey light filtering through our windows, where the fog hung like theatrical gauze over the morning traffic. "Though I confess I fail to see the application of such knowledge to your usual pursuits." He looked up then, his grey eyes sharp as flint. "Every trade has its signature, Watson, as distinctive as a thumbprint. The watchmaker leaves his mark in the thickness of a spring, the angle of a jewel setting, the very oil he selects for the escapement. When a man's work becomes the instrument of his death, these details acquire a most pressing significance." Before I could inquire further, the familiar tread of Mrs. Hudson upon the stair announced a visitor. Our landlady, her face betraying more than usual concern, ushered into our sitting-room a young woman whose appearance spoke eloquently of distress held rigidly in check by breeding and determination. She was, perhaps, 25, dressed in mourning of such recent adoption that the crepe still held its factory stiffness. Her gloved hands clutched a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and her eyes, grey as a winter sea, moved between Holmes and myself with an appeal that required no words. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice steady despite the pallor of her cheeks. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood. I come to you because the police will not listen. My family thinks me mad with grief, and yet I am certain, that my father was murdered." Holmes gestured to the basket chair near the fire. "Please sit, Miss Blackwood. Watson, perhaps some brandy?" The lady has walked some distance in the cold. He had observed, as I now did, the splash of mud upon her boots that spoke of hurried passage through unpaved lanes, and the slight breathlessness that suggested rapid movement coupled with emotional agitation. When she was settled, with a glass warming in her hands, though she scarcely tasted it, Holmes resumed his seat and steepled his fingers in that attitude which I knew presaged his fullest attention. "Your father's profession?" "He was a watchmaker," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "Perhaps you knew of him. Silas Blackwood of Clerkenwell. He was accounted the finest craftsman in London for complicated mechanisms. Tower clocks, astronomical timepieces, chronometers for the Admiralty. There was no commission too intricate for his skill." "I know the name," Holmes said quietly. "His death was reported in last week's papers. An accident in his workshop, was it not? A fire? That is what they say." Her knuckles whitened upon the glass. "That he fell asleep over his work, that a candle guttered and caught the oil-soaked rags, that he was overcome by smoke before he could escape. But Mr. Holmes, my father, never worked by candlelight. He had gas lamps installed 2 years ago, and he would no more sleep in his workshop than a soldier would sleep on sentry duty. His work was his religion, Mr. Holmes, and he observed its rites with absolute devotion." Holmes's eyes had brightened with that peculiar light which animated them when a problem worthy of his faculties presented itself. Yet the police found no evidence of foul play. They found what they expected to find: an old man, a locked workshop, an accident waiting to happen. Inspector Gregson was kind, but he made it clear that widowers who live alone and work through the night are prone to such tragedies. She set down the glass with a sharp click. But they did not know my father, as I did. And they did not see this. She unwrapped the parcel with trembling fingers, revealing a pocket watch of exquisite craftsmanship. Even in the grey morning light, it gleamed with the warm lustre of old gold. Holmes took it with the reverence one might afford a holy relic, turning it slowly in his long fingers, his lens appearing as if by conjuration. "A repeater," he murmured, pressing the stem. The watch chimed the hours and quarters in a voice pure as a distant bell. Swiss movement, English case, probably dating from the late 60s. But see here, Watson. He tilted it toward the light, revealing on the inner case an inscription so tiny I had to lean close to read it. Tempus edax rerum, H.M. Time, the devourer of all things, I translated, my schoolboy Latin creaking into service, and the initials, H.M. Was this your father's work? It came in the post the morning after his death, Miss Blackwood said. There was no note, no sender's address. But I found this. She produced a scrap of paper, upon which was written in a spidery hand, "The third betrayal demands the final payment. The curse will be satisfied." The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the very watches Holmes had been examining, their mechanical hearts beating out time with relentless precision. Holmes rose and paced to the window, where he stood with his back to us, silhouetted against the fog-dimmed light, like a figure in a shadow play. "Miss Blackwood," he said at last, "I must ask you questions which may seem impertinent, but I assure you they are material. Was your father a man of regular habits? Absolutely. He rose at 6, took breakfast at past, was in his workshop by 7. He would work until noon, take a light luncheon, and continue until 6 in the evening. 3 evenings a week he attended the Clockmakers' Guild in Red Lion Square. Debts, enemies, romantic entanglements. A faint colour rose in her cheeks. My father was a widower these 20 years, Mr. Holmes. He lived for his work and for me. As to debts, quite the contrary. He was a frugal man who invested wisely. His bank account, I discovered, contains nearly £3,000. Holmes turned sharply. You say, discovered? He did not discuss his finances with you. He was secretive about money, yes, but only, I thought, from that natural reserve which comes from having once known poverty. He had risen from apprenticeship to mastery through skill alone. And this curse mentioned in the note, does it mean anything to you? She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the shadow of something long buried and fearfully regarded. There were 3 of them, she said at last, 3 young men who trained together under old Master Cornelius Thorne in Clerkenwell 30 years ago. My father, Henry Mordaunt, and James Ashford. They were called Thorne's Trinity, the finest apprentices of their generation. They took a vow, my father once told me, a foolish, youthful thing, that they would remain loyal to their craft and to each other, that they would never put profit before perfection, never reveal the secrets they learned. And, Holmes prompted, for she had faltered again, and 5 years after their apprenticeship ended, James Ashford was found dead in the Thames. Drowned, they said, though he was a strong swimmer. Henry Mordaunt died 7 years ago in Birmingham, crushed, they said, when a tower clock he was installing fell upon him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Before each death, a watch was received. A golden repeater, inscribed with those same words. Holmes's face had assumed that expression of fierce concentration which transformed his aquiline features into something predatory and magnificent. And the initials H.M.? Henry Mordaunt. Each watch bore the initials of the next to die. Then your father knew he was marked, Holmes said softly. Did he take precautions? He barred his workshop windows. He changed the locks. He spoke to no one of it, save me, and that only days before his death. He said, her voice broke, and for the first time tears spilled upon her cheeks. He said that curses, like debts, must eventually be paid, that he and his fellows had done something unforgivable, something that cried out for retribution. But he would not tell me what. Holmes crossed the room and took the watch from where he had laid it upon the mantelpiece, weighing it in his palm as though it were not gold and spring steel, but the very sum of a man's guilt and fare. Miss Blackwood, I will take your case, but I must warn you, if your father died by another's hand, that hand may reach out again. You must take precautions. Do you live alone? I have lodgings in Bloomsbury with a respectable widow. Good. Return there now and speak of this to no one. Watson and I will visit your father's workshop this afternoon. We shall want to see everything exactly as it was found. No cleaning, no tidying by well-meaning relatives. When she had gone, trailing her grief like a shadow down our 17 steps, Holmes threw himself into his chair with that curious mixture of languor and barely suppressed energy which characterized him between the acceptance of a case and the commencement of action. Well, Watson, you have the facts. What do you make of them? I had learned, over our years of association, that Holmes valued my observations not for their brilliance, which I cheerfully admitted fell far short of his own, but rather as a touchstone of the ordinary man's reasoning. It seems clear enough, I ventured. 3 men bound by a youthful oath, perhaps involved in some crime or betrayal. Someone seeks revenge across the decades, patient as time itself, marking each death with a watch like a calling card. Capital, Holmes exclaimed, though whether in genuine approbation or gentle mockery I could not tell. You have the essential facts arranged in due order. But you have neglected the supreme question, the watchmaker's question, if you will. Which is, not who winds the watch, Watson, but who made it. Chapter 2. The Workshop of Shadows. The afternoon found us rattling through the narrow streets of Clerkenwell in a hansom cab, the horse's breath steaming in the October chill. Holmes had been silent throughout the journey, his sharp profile turned toward the window, his fingers drumming upon his knee with the restless rhythm of a man whose mind races far ahead of his body. I knew better than to interrupt these reveries, which were as essential to his methods as the more visible acts of investigation. Silas Blackwood's workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building in a lane that seemed to have been forgotten by the march of progress which had transformed so much of London. Here, the medieval city still lingered in overhanging eaves and cobbled courts, in the smell of soot and old wood, in the shadows that gathered early and lingered late. A constable stood guard at the door, a young man whose face betrayed both relief and apprehension at Holmes's approach. "Mr. Holmes, sir," he said, touching his helmet. "Inspector Gregson said you might call. I'm to show you everything, though I confess there's precious little to see. A sad business, but clear enough for all that. We shall form our own conclusions, Constable. Bartlett, sir. I was first on the scene when the fire brigade called us. Poor old gentleman was past all help by then. The workshop door, charred at its base but otherwise intact, opened with a scrape that spoke of swollen wood and twisted hinges. The smell that greeted us was a pungent amalgam of burnt cloth, seared wood, and something else. Something chemical and acrid that caught in the throat. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his nostrils flaring like a hound upon the scent, his eyes sweeping the room with that peculiar intensity which seemed to photograph every detail in a single glance. The room was perhaps 20 feet square, lit by 2 tall windows, now covered with grime and smoke damage. What had once been an orderly workshop of the highest class was now a chaos of ruin, workbenches blackened, tools scattered, the floor thick with ash and the sodden wreckage left by the fire brigade's hoses. Yet Holmes moved through this devastation with the assurance of a man reading a familiar text, his long fingers touching here a twisted spring, there a half-melted ingot of brass, now stooping to examine a patch of floor, now rising to peer at the ceiling beams. "The body was found there," Constable Bartlett said, pointing to a cleared space near the largest workbench. On his back he was, arms at his sides. Doctor said the smoke got him before the flames, which is a mercy of sorts. Holmes said nothing, but I saw his gaze linger upon the spot and then travel slowly across the floor toward the door. He dropped to one knee, heedless of the filth, and produced his lens. For several minutes he remained thus, occasionally making a small mark with a piece of chalk he carried in his pocket, until he had traced what appeared to be a wandering path from the workbench to within 3 feet of the door. Watson, your opinion as a medical man. A man overcome by smoke. How would he move? I considered the question. With increasing disorientation, I should think. Possibly crawling, seeking fresh air. He would head toward windows or doors if conscious enough to do so. Quite so, and yet our watchmaker was found on his back, arms at his sides, as though he had simply lain down to sleep amid the flames. Does this not strike you as singular? Perhaps he was already unconscious when the fire started? An excellent suggestion, and one which we shall explore. But observe these marks upon the floor, barely visible beneath the ash and water, but clear enough to my lens. What do you make of them? I bent to look where he indicated. They appear to be footprints, but distorted, smudged. The footprints of a man being dragged, Holmes said with quiet certainty. Note the scuff marks, the irregular spacing, the way the ash has been disturbed in parallel lines. Someone pulled the body from there. He pointed to a spot near the door, to its final position by the workbench. The question is why. Constable Bartlett had gone pale. You're saying it weren't an accident, sir? I am saying that what appears obvious is not always true. Let us examine the supposed source of the fire. Where was the candle found? There, sir, on that shelf, or what's left of it. Burned clean through it did, and the oil rags beneath it caught like tinder. Holmes approached the indicated spot, which was indeed charred beyond recognition. But his attention seemed focused not upon the shelf itself, but upon the wall behind it, where the gas pipe ran up from the floor. He produced a small knife from his pocket and scraped at the pipe's surface, collecting a residue upon the blade, which he sniffed delicately. Gas was installed 2 years ago, you said. According to Miss Blackwood, yes. And yet our watchmaker chose to work by candlelight on the night of his death. Curious, is it not? A man who prides himself on his modern methods, who installs expensive gas fixtures for the precision they afford, suddenly reverts to the most primitive form of illumination. He moved to the workbench, where the tools of Blackwood's trade lay in sorry disarray. With infinite care, he began sorting through them, calipers and files, tiny hammers and screwdrivers, loops and measures of bewildering variety. One item in particular seemed to arrest his attention, a small oil lamp with a broken glass chimney lying on its side beneath the bench. Aha, he breathed, lifting it with the tenderness one might show a wounded bird. Watson, observe the wick. What do you see? I peered at the indicated object. It appears to be trimmed quite short, and the oil reservoir is empty. More than empty. Bone dry, with not so much as a stain to show recent use. Yet see this char mark upon the metal base, and this residue upon my finger when I touch it. He held up his hand, showing a faint, oily smear that caught the dim light. This is not lamp oil, Watson. This is something rather more volatile. I suspect our chemical analysis will reveal it to be a mixture of paraffin and turpentine, an excellent accelerant for one who wishes to ensure a thorough conflagration. Then the fire was deliberately set. Oh, undoubtedly. But by whom, and for what purpose? That is the question which will require more than mere observation to answer. He straightened, his eyes roaming once more across the ruined workshop. Tell me, Constable, was the door locked when you arrived? From the inside, sir, yes. Had to break it down? We did. The key was in the lock. And the windows. Barred on the inside, everyone. Fire brigade checked them thorough, hoping to get in that way. Holmes's smile was thin and cold. A locked room, Watson. How the sensation papers would love it. And yet the solution, I suspect, is prosaic enough for all its tragedy. Come, I have seen what I came to see. We must visit the Clockmakers' Guild and ask some rather pointed questions about Thorne's Trinity and the nature of their famous vow. As we emerged into the lane where the autumn twilight had begun its premature descent, I caught Holmes by the sleeve. You know who did this. I know how it was done, which is not the same thing. The who and the why will require investigation of a different sort. But yes, Watson, the outlines of the thing are clear enough. What we have before us is murder of a most deliberate kind, planned with the precision of a master watchmaker, and executed with the patience of one who understands that time, as the inscription says, devours all things, including justice. That, said Holmes, his voice hard as steel, remains to be seen. Chapter 3. The Guild's Secret. The Clockmakers' Guild occupied a venerable building in Red Lion Square, its facade weathered by 2 centuries of London soot and fog into a complexion the colour of old pewter. A porter admitted us to a hallway lined with portraits of past masters, their painted faces regarding us with that peculiar severity which the Victorians reserved for official portraiture. The smell of beeswax polish and old leather hung in the air, mingled with the pervasive ticking of 100 timepieces whose rhythms fell into and out of synchronization like a conversation in an unknown tongue. Holmes had sent word ahead, and we were expected by the Guild's current master, a rotund gentleman named Josiah Pembridge, whose grey whiskers and gold watch chain spoke of prosperity and respectability. He received us in a panelled chamber dominated by a massive astronomical clock whose complexity made my head spin merely to contemplate it. Terrible business about Blackwood, Pembridge said, settling his bulk into a leather chair that creaked protest. Finest craftsman of his generation, and a tragedy that he should end thus. Though I confess, Mr. Holmes, I fail to see what interest you might take in what was clearly an accidental death. Holmes had been examining the astronomical clock with evident appreciation, but now he turned his penetrating gaze upon our host. Did you know him well? As well as any. We served together on various committees. He was not a gregarious man, you understand, but his skill commanded universal respect. I am interested in his early years, his apprenticeship under Cornelius Thorne. Pembridge's affable expression flickered like a candle in a draught. Ah, you have heard of that, then. Ancient history, Mr. Holmes. Thorne has been dead these 20 years. But his apprentices live on, or did until recently. 3 young men, bound by some manner of oath. What can you tell me of them? The master of the guild rose and paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier warmth. I tell you this in confidence, Mr. Holmes, and only because I understand from Miss Blackwood that she has engaged your services. What passed between those 3 men is not generally known, and for good reason. I am the soul of discretion, Holmes assured him. Pembridge sighed. Very well, Cornelius Thorne was a genius, but a difficult master. His standards were impossibly high, his methods unorthodox. He accepted only 3 apprentices in his entire career, and he worked them mercilessly. Blackwood, Mordaunt, and Ashford. They learned arts that other watchmakers could only dream of. complications of such intricacy that other craftsmen swore they were impossible, tower clocks that kept time to the second across years of operation, repeaters whose chimes could be heard across a room, yet required no more than a whisper of spring tension. And the oath was sworn upon completion of their apprenticeship. They vowed never to reveal Thorn's methods, never to profit improperly from his teaching, and never to betray the bond of brotherhood they had formed in his workshop. It was sealed with the creation of 3 watches, identical golden repeaters, each bearing Thorn's motto, Tempus edax rerum. Holmes leaned forward. And was this oath kept? Another long pause. No, Pembridge said at last. Within 5 years, James Ashford had died under circumstances that some found suspicious. Before his death, there had been rumours that he had sold some of Thorn's secret techniques to a Swiss manufacturer. Whether true or false, his reputation was destroyed, and many believed the shame drove him to self-destruction. And Mordaunt met a similar fate years later. There were whispers that he had been using inferior materials in his tower clocks while charging for the finest, pocketing the difference. When one of his clocks failed catastrophically in Birmingham, killing a workman, he was ruined. The accident that claimed his own life shortly thereafter was seen by some as divine justice. Leaving Blackwood the last survivor, Holmes mused, and someone decided that he too must pay for whatever betrayal he committed. If betrayal there was, Pembridge said quickly. These were rumours only, Mr. Holmes. Blackwood maintained his innocence to his dying day, and his work bore out his claims. No man who cut corners could have produced what he did. Holmes rose and paced the room, his nervous energy no longer containable. Yet someone believed otherwise. Someone who knew the old story, who had access to one of the original watches or the skill to create a forgery, and who possessed both the patience and the malice to bring each man to account across the span of decades. You cannot mean... Pembridge had gone quite pale. Surely you do not suggest that Thorn himself is dead these 20 years, you said. No, our culprit lives and breathes and moves through London even now. Someone who has intimate knowledge of the guild, of its members, of watchmaking techniques sophisticated enough to deceive even an expert. Someone, moreover, who has access to your records and your secrets. That is preposterous. Every member of this guild is above suspicion, I am sure, Holmes finished dryly. Nevertheless, I will require a list of all current members, with particular attention to those who were active 30 years ago, and might have known Thorn personally. I will also need to examine any records pertaining to Ashford's and Mordaunt's deaths, and any correspondence Blackwood may have filed with the guild in recent years. Pembridge drew himself up with wounded dignity. This is most irregular, Mr. Holmes. I shall have to consult with my fellow officers before. You will do nothing of the kind, Holmes interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp as a blade, unless you wish to see another member of your guild meet with a fatal accident. Time, Mr. Pembridge, is not on our side. The watchmaker's curse, as Miss Blackwood calls it, may not yet be satisfied. Consider this. 3 men swore an oath. 3 men received watches. 3 men died. But there was a 4th person in Thorn's workshop all those years ago. 4th, but there were only the 3 apprentices. And the master himself, Cornelius Thorn. Where is he buried, Mr. Pembridge? At Highgate Cemetery. A modest grave, I believe. He died in poverty. his genius unrecognized by the larger world. But what has this to do? Holmes was already at the door. Everything, possibly. Watson, bring your service revolver. We have a grave to visit, and if my deductions are correct, we may find it occupied by more than mere bones. The fog had thickened during our interview, and the streets of London had become a labyrinth of shadows and muffled sounds. As our cab threaded its way northward toward Highgate, I found myself gripping my revolver through the fabric of my coat pocket, possessed by a sensation I could not name. A feeling that we were racing not merely against time, but against some force that had been gathering strength across 30 long years, patient as the grave itself, and twice as cold. Chapter 4. The revelation in the cemetery, Highgate. Cemetery in the gathering darkness was a Gothic nightmare made manifest. The older section, where Cornelius Thorne lay buried, sprawled across a hillside of such rampant overgrowth that nature seemed to be reclaiming her own, with vegetable vengeance. Ivy strangled monuments, roots buckled paths, and the stone angels that marked the resting places of the wealthy had weathered into expressions of such profound melancholy that they might have been mourning their own decay. Holmes had engaged the services of a sexton, a shambling creature with a lantern and a manner that suggested he was more comfortable with the dead than the living. By his flickering light, we wound through the necropolis until we stood before a modest headstone bearing the inscription, Cornelius Thorne, Master Watchmaker, 1801 to 1869. His works continue. The grave has not been disturbed, the sexton assured us, his voice a wheeze in the darkness. I would have noticed, sir. I notice everything. Holmes produced a sovereign, which disappeared into the sexton's pocket with practiced speed. Nevertheless, I should like to examine the earth. Your spade, if you please. What followed was 15 minutes of the most macabre labor I had yet witnessed in my associations with Holmes. While I held the lantern and the sexton muttered disapproval, my friend scraped away the turf and topsoil with a delicacy that would have done credit to an archaeologist. He was not, I realized, looking for disturbance from above, but for evidence of activity from below. Ah, he said at last, straightening with a grunt. Watson, observe this. He held up a fragment of wood, rotted but still identifiable as part of a coffin lid. And this. A scrap of cloth, mouldering and stained, but bearing the unmistakable remains of a brass button. Someone has robbed the grave, I ventured. Nothing so crude. Someone has examined it, very carefully, within the past months. See how this earth has been sifted, how the edges of this hole have been carved rather than broken. This was the work of someone who knew precisely what they sought and wished to leave no obvious trace. But what could anyone hope to find in a grave 60 years old? Not hope, Watson. No. They came seeking proof of something, and I believe they found it. He ran his fingers through the disturbed earth, examining it with his lens in the lantern light. Traces of fresh candle wax here and here. Our visitor worked by night, and this. He lifted something small and gleaming, which he wrapped carefully in his handkerchief. A watchmaker's screwdriver, modern manufacture, lost in haste or excitement. The sexton had gone quite pale. If you're suggesting someone dug up old Thorne, I am suggesting nothing of the kind. Rather, someone wished to confirm what Thorne took to his grave, perhaps literally. Come, we have trespassed enough upon the dead. We must return to the world of the living, where the answers we seek are both more accessible and more dangerous. Back in Baker Street, with a fire burning merrily against the October chill and a decanter of brandy at hand, Holmes laid out upon our table the various articles he had collected: the fragment of coffin, the cloth, the screwdriver, and the watch that Eleanor Blackwood had brought us that morning. He arranged them with the precision of a jeweller setting stones, his long fingers moving among them as he constructed some invisible pattern that only his trained mind could perceive. "Watson, let me lay before you the anatomy of this crime, for crime it most certainly is. 30 years ago, 3 apprentices completed their training under a master watchmaker of genius. They swore an oath of loyalty and secrecy. Within 5 years, one was dead. 7 years ago, another. Last week, the third. Each death preceded by the arrival of a golden watch bearing the motto Tempus Edax Rerum and the initials of the deceased." "The pattern is clear enough," I said. "Someone is exacting revenge for some betrayal committed 3 decades ago. But whose revenge, and for what betrayal? That is where most would founder. But consider. The oath was sworn to keep Thorn's secrets. The implication is that those secrets were betrayed. Yet Thorn himself died in poverty, suggesting he profited nothing from any treachery. What, then, was the nature of the secret?" He paused, and I saw in his eyes that peculiar gleam which signaled he had reached the heart of the puzzle. "The answer, Watson, lies not in watchmaking, but in something far more precious. Something that 3 ambitious young men discovered in their master's workshop. Something they swore to keep hidden, and something that at least one of them, and possibly all 3, subsequently attempted to profit from. But what could be more valuable than Thorn's techniques?" "His gold," Holmes said simply. He lifted the watch, letting it catch the firelight. "This is not merely an old timepiece, Watson. The case is not gold plate, but solid gold of exceptional purity. Thorn was not merely a craftsman. He was an alchemist of sorts, able to refine and purify gold to a degree that made it both more beautiful and more valuable than ordinary commercial gold. That was his true secret, and that is what his apprentices swore to keep. And they betrayed him? Ashford certainly did, selling the technique to a Swiss manufacturer. Mordaunt probably did, using his inferior materials scheme as a cover for small-scale gold refining. Blackwood," he paused. "Blackwood may have been innocent, or he may simply have been the cleverest of the 3, profiting slowly and carefully while his brothers rushed to their doom. But this does not explain who is killing them now, or why. If Thorn died in poverty." "Ah, but did he?" Holmes leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What if Thorn's poverty was a fiction? What if the old man, betrayed by those he trusted most, decided to exact a terrible revenge? What if he planned, over the remaining years of his life, a retribution so patient and so perfect that it would span decades?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. "You are suggesting that Thorn himself is dead, most certainly. But consider, before his death he created the watches, 3 golden repeaters, identical and perfect. He inscribed them with his motto, Time devours all things. Perhaps he even set in motion some mechanism, some deadfall that would trigger across the years. And then he recruited an agent, someone young enough to outlive his betrayers, someone devoted enough to carry out his master's wishes without question. An apprentice of his own? More than that, Watson. A sun. The word hung in the air like smoke. Holmes rose and paced to the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing seeking entry. Thorne was not married, according to guild records, but natural sons were common enough in that era, particularly for men of genius who lived outside conventional society. Suppose Thorne had such a son, illegitimate but acknowledged, trained in the same craft, heir to the same secrets. Suppose this son witnessed his father's betrayal, his decline, his death in poverty. Suppose the old man, on his deathbed, extracted a promise that each betrayer would die by the method of their own profession, accident masquerading as fate. That each death would be preceded by a watch marked with initials as a calling card and a curse. Have you proof of this son's existence? Not yet. But I have a name. Watson, fetch down my reference volume on the Clockmakers' Guild, the blue volume on the second shelf. Let us see who joined the guild in the 5 years following Thorne's death. The volume was massive, bound in crumbling leather, its pages foxed with age. Holmes rifled through it with the speed of long practice, his finger tracing down lists of names and dates. Suddenly he stopped, and a slow smile spread across his sharp features. "Here," he said, tapping the page. "Thomas Thorne, admitted to the guild in 1871, 2 years after Cornelius Thorne's death. Specialty: complicated astronomical mechanisms and tower clocks. Current address: still in London? A workshop in Clerkenwell, not 5 streets from where Silas Blackwood met his end." Holmes closed the book with a snap that echoed like a pistol shot. "And here is the final proof of method, if not yet of guilt. Thomas Thorne specializes in tower clocks, the very mechanism that killed Mordaunt in Birmingham. He would have intimate knowledge of how to engineer such a collapse. He would also possess the skill to forge the golden watches, or to have inherited the originals from his father's estate. And he would have had years, decades, to plan each death with the precision of a master craftsman setting the gears of a clock." I felt my hand move instinctively toward my revolver. "We must confront him at once." "Not yet, Watson. We have theory, but we lack the one element that would satisfy a British jury: proof of his presence at the scene of Blackwood's death. A locked room, remember, locked from the inside, with bars upon the windows. How did our murderer enter, and more importantly, how did he leave? Perhaps there is a secret passage, some hidden door. No, I examined every inch of that workshop. The room was sealed as tight as a drum. Yet someone entered, rendered Blackwood unconscious. I suspect chloroform, given the suddenness of his collapse, arranged the scene to suggest accident, set the fire, and departed, leaving the door locked behind him. Holmes's eyes were distant, his mind working through possibilities with mechanical precision. There is only one solution, Watson, and it is so audacious in its simplicity that I nearly missed it. Which is that our murderer never left at all, or rather, that he left long before, we suppose, leaving behind an agent more patient than any human accomplice. Holmes, you speak in riddles. Then let me illuminate them. What is a watchmaker's supreme skill, Watson? The creation of mechanisms that perform actions at predetermined times. A repeater strikes the hours automatically. An alarm bell rings at the appointed moment. A tower clock chimes without human intervention. What if Blackwood's death was accomplished not by a man present in the room, but by a device, a devilishly clever device, set in motion hours or even days before, designed to create the appearance of accident, while the murderer established an unshakable alibi elsewhere. The brandy had gone cold in my glass. You believe Thorne created some sort of, what, a mechanical murderer? Precisely. And tomorrow we shall prove it. We will return to that workshop, and we will find the mechanism that killed Silas Blackwood. But tonight, Watson, we must prepare. For when we confront Thomas Thorne with our evidence, I suspect he will not come quietly. He has waited 30 years for his revenge. He will not see it incomplete. Chapter 5. The Mechanism of Justice. The dawn broke grey and reluctant over Clerkenwell, as though London herself was hesitant to illuminate what we might discover. Holmes had sent a note to Inspector Gregson, requesting his presence at the workshop, but we arrived first, in that still hour when the city hovers between sleep and waking. The constable on duty admitted us with a sleepy salute, and once more we stood amid the charred ruins of Silas Blackwood's life's work. Holmes moved directly to the area near the workbench where the body had been found. He knelt, and for long minutes examined the floor with such concentration that he seemed to have forgotten my presence entirely. Then, with a sound of satisfaction, he produced his knife and began to pry at what appeared to be an ordinary floorboard. Watson, your assistance. This board has been cut and refinished, but see how it differs from its neighbours, a fraction of an inch shorter, to allow for movement. Help me lift it. Together we raised the board, revealing beneath it a cavity, perhaps 6 inches deep and 2 feet square. Within lay a tangle of a clockwork, such as I had never seen. Brass gears and steel springs, wires and pulleys, all connected to a small glass vial mounted in a wooden frame. The vial was empty now, but a faint, sweet smell lingered about it. Chloroform, Holmes said, lifting the vial with infinite care. Delivered by a mechanism of fiendish ingenuity. Observe, this tube runs beneath the floorboards to a small vent that would have released the vapour directly beneath Blackwood's chair. The release was controlled by this clockwork timer, set, see here, to activate at midnight. Blackwood, working late as was his custom, would have been overcome within minutes, never knowing what struck him. But the fire was the second part of the mechanism. This wire runs to the shelf where the supposed candle was found. I believe we will discover, upon closer examination, that it terminated in a small electrical element, powered by a voltaic cell, here, you see, and designed to ignite the accelerant that had been carefully placed among the oil rags. The fire would destroy the evidence, consume the workshop, and leave behind only the appearance of a tragic accident. Monstrous, I breathed, to kill a man with clockwork. To kill a man with his own art, Holmes corrected. That was the refinement of Thorne's revenge. Each death a mirror of the victim's profession. Ashford, the swimmer, drowned. Mordaunt, the tower clock builder, crushed by falling mechanism. Blackwood, the fine craftsman, murdered by the most delicate machine of all. Poetry of a sort, Watson, though written in blood. A sound at the door made us both turn. Inspector Gregson entered, his honest face creased with puzzlement, followed by a tall, spare man of perhaps 50 years, with the long fingers and stooped shoulders of one who has spent his life bent over delicate work. His face was gaunt, his eyes deep-set, and burning with an intensity that spoke of long-nursed passion. "Mr. Holmes," Gregson said, "I've brought Thomas Thorne as you requested. He came most willing, though I confess I don't understand your reasons." "Mr. Thorne understands them well enough, I think," Holmes said quietly. "Don't you, sir?" Thomas Thorne's gaze moved from Holmes to the exposed mechanism in the floor, and something in his expression shifted, a settling, as of a great weight finally laid down. When he spoke, his voice was cultured, but weary, the voice of a man who has carried a burden too long. "I wondered if you would find it," he said. "I built it well, perhaps too well. Even after it had served its purpose, it remained a testament to my craft." My father would have appreciated the irony. "Your father," Holmes said, "who died in poverty, while the men he trusted most grew wealthy on his secrets." "My father," Thorne replied, his voice hardening, "who gave those three vipers everything, his knowledge, his techniques, his very soul, and was repaid with betrayal. They swore an oath, Mr. Holmes, and they broke it within 5 years. Ashford sold father's gold refining process to a Swiss manufacturer for £500. Mordaunt used it to establish his own business, claiming the method as his own invention. And Blackwood," his lips twisted, "Blackwood was the cleverest. He waited, profited slowly, invested wisely, and grew rich while my father died in a pauper's ward, his genius unrecognized, his life's work stolen." "So you decided to exact justice," Holmes said, "patient justice, measured out across 3 decades." "I was 15 when my father died," Thorne said, "old enough to understand what had been done to him, young enough to devote my life to avenging it. He made me swear on his deathbed that I would see the oath enforced, that each betrayer would face judgment. It took years to plan, years to perfect each method. But I am my father's son, Mr. Holmes. I understand patience. I understand mechanisms. I understand that time devours all things, including mercy." Gregson had gone pale. "You're confessing to 3 murders?" "I am confessing to 3 executions," Thorne corrected. "The law failed my father. The guild failed him. Even God, it seemed, had failed him. So I became the instrument of justice that none other would provide." He looked at Holmes with something almost like respect. "How did you know?" "The watchers were too perfect," Holmes replied. "Only someone with access to Cornelius Thorne's original molds and techniques could have created them. The methods were too precise, too tailored to each victim's profession. And the patience, 30 years of patience, suggested not mere revenge, but filial duty, carried to its terrible conclusion. You were the only person with motive, means, and, most damningly, the skill to engineer deaths that appeared accidental even to experienced investigators." "Will you come quietly, Mr. Thorne?" Gregson asked, his hand moving toward his handcuffs. Thorne smiled, a thin, bitter expression. "I will. My work is complete. The oath has been enforced. My father's ghost can rest." He looked once more at the mechanism in the floor, and I saw in his eyes something like pride. "It was my masterwork, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps the finest mechanism I shall ever create. There is artistry in justice when properly calibrated." As Gregson led him away, Thomas Thorne paused at the door and looked back at us. "Tell Miss Blackwood," he said, "that her father was the least guilty of the 3. He at least felt remorse. The watch I sent him bore not just his own initials, but those of Mordaunt and Ashford as well, a reminder of the company he kept. He knew what was coming, Mr. Holmes, and in his way, I think he accepted it. Time devours all things, including the lies we tell ourselves about our own innocence." Then he was gone, and Holmes and I stood alone in the ruined workshop, surrounded by the wreckage of lives and secrets and 30 years of calculated revenge. "A strange case," I said at last. "I find myself almost sympathetic to the murderer." "Sympathy is a luxury we cannot afford," Holmes replied, carefully dismantling the mechanism and placing its parts into his pockets. "Thomas Thorne created marvels of mechanical precision, Watson, but he forgot the most important principle of watchmaking, that a timepiece, no matter how cunningly constructed, must ultimately serve humanity, not destroy it. He allowed his genius to be corrupted by grief and rage, and in seeking to punish betrayal, he became a betrayer himself, of the law, of civilized society, of his own better nature. We emerged into the grey light of morning, where the city was waking to its daily rhythms, the rattle of carts, the cries of vendors, the distant chime of church bells marking the hours. Holmes paused to light his pipe, and for a moment we stood watching London come to life around us. "And yet," I ventured, "there is something in me that understands his compulsion. To see your father destroyed, your heritage stolen." "There is something in all of us that understands it," Holmes interrupted. "That is what makes the case so dangerous, Watson. Thomas Thorne is not a monster. He is a man who allowed love to curdle into obsession, who confused justice with vengeance, who built a perfect machine of retribution, and then became enslaved by it. He forgot that the greatest mechanism ever devised, the human heart, requires mercy as its mainspring, or it ceases to beat in any manner we might call human." Later that day, I accompanied Holmes to Miss Blackwood's lodgings in Bloomsbury, where we found her pale but composed, strengthened perhaps by the certainty that now replaced doubt. Holmes related the facts with his customary precision, sparing neither her father's guilt nor Thomas Thorne's terrible devotion. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her grey eyes distant. "My father knew," she said at last. "In those final days, he knew death was approaching. He told me once that every debt must be paid, that time settles all accounts. I thought it was mere melancholy, the morbid fancy of an aging man. But he was preparing me, wasn't he? Preparing me to understand that he was not innocent, that he had lived for 30 years with guilt as his constant companion." "He attempted to make amends," Holmes said gently. "His bank account contained £3,000, a sum that, I believe, represented his estimate of his ill-gotten profits. I suspect he intended it as restitution, though death prevented him from determining the proper recipients." "Then let it be restitution now," Miss Blackwood said with sudden decision. "Let the money be divided among watchmakers, widows, and orphans in the name of Cornelius Thorne. Let some good come from all this grief and guilt and death." "A fitting memorial," Holmes agreed, "and a reminder that time devours all things, except perhaps the opportunity to choose how we shall be remembered." That evening, as the October darkness settled once more over Baker Street, I sat by our fire recording the case, while Holmes, in the opposite chair, drew slow, meditative notes from his violin. The music was melancholy, but not without beauty, like autumn itself, a recognition that all things pass, that all debts come due, that time moves forward with mechanical precision, indifferent to our regrets. "You are unusually philosophical tonight, Watson," Holmes observed, lowering his bow. "I can hear you thinking from across the room." "I was considering the nature of justice," I admitted. Whether it can be calculated as precisely as a watchmaker calibrates a spring, or whether it requires something more, something human and imperfect, and perhaps more merciful. "You have reached the heart of the matter," Holmes said, setting aside his violin. "Thomas Thorne created a perfect engine of justice, mechanically flawless in its execution. And yet it was profoundly wrong, for it lacked the one quality that distinguishes justice from mere revenge. It made no allowance for redemption, no space for mercy, no recognition that human beings, unlike watches, can be repaired, reformed, made to run true again." He rose and moved to the window, where the fog had begun its nightly siege of London, softening the harsh edges of the city into something dreamlike and strange. "That is why we have laws, Watson, and judges, and juries of fallible human beings. Not because they are perfect, God knows they are not, but because they understand that justice, to be truly just, must accommodate the possibility that people change, that guilt is not always absolute, that time devours not only all things, but also the certainty of our judgments." I completed my notes and closed my journal, conscious that I was recording not merely a case, but a meditation on the nature of retribution itself. The fire settled in the grate, sending up a shower of sparks that died before reaching the ceiling, like the lives of the men in this story. Bright for a moment, then gone, leaving only ash and the memory of light. "Do you suppose," I asked, "that Thomas Thorne will find peace now that his work is complete?" Holmes turned from the window, his aquiline profile sharp against the fog-dimmed glass. "Peace? No, Watson. He will find what he has always found, the companionship of mechanisms and the cold comfort of precision. But he will no longer find purpose, and that may be the greatest punishment of all. He built his life around vengeance, calibrated every moment to serve that single aim. Now that it is accomplished, he is like a clock whose mainspring has wound down, still perfect in its construction, but without the animating force that once gave it meaning. A grim fate. But a fitting one, Holmes replied. He chose to be a mechanism rather than a man. And mechanisms, Watson, do not dream, do not grow, do not change. They simply run down and stop. The hour had grown late, and the city beyond our windows had settled into that particular stillness that comes in the small hours when even London holds her breath. I rose to retire, but paused at the door of my room. "Holmes," I said. "Thank you." He raised an eyebrow. "For what, precisely?" "For being human," I replied. "For understanding that justice requires a heart as well as a mind, mercy as well as logic, for not being a mechanism." A rare smile touched his lips. "My dear Watson, I'm often accused of being too much the calculating machine, all brain and no heart. It is gratifying to know that at least one person recognizes that I am, in fact, gloriously, fallibly human. Now, off to bed with you. Tomorrow we may have a case that requires less philosophy and more action, and I shall need you at your best." I retired to my room, but sleep came slowly. Through the wall I could hear the faint sound of Holmes's violin, playing again that melancholy air, and it seemed to me that the music was a prayer of sorts, for Silas Blackwood, for Thomas Thorne, for Cornelius Thorne and his betrayed legacy, for all those who had been caught in the mechanism of vengeance and ground beneath its precise, unforgiving gears. And perhaps, too, it was a reminder that we, the living, must choose in each moment whether to be clockwork or human, mechanism or man. whether to let time devour us, or to seize from time itself those moments of grace, mercy, and redemption that make our brief existence something more than the sum of our betrayals and regrets. The music faded at last into silence, and London, that great sleeping beast, murmured in her dreams of fog and fire and the endless ticking of 10,000 clocks, marking the hours, counting the days, measuring out the lives of men who were, all of them, racing against time itself. That devourer of all things, save, perhaps, the stories we tell and the choices we make in the face of our own mortality. Thus ended the case which I have recorded in my journals as The Adventure of the Watchmaker's Curse, a case that taught me that justice, like watchmaking, requires both precision and humanity. That vengeance is a mechanism which, once set in motion, may destroy its creator as surely as its target, and that time, for all its devouring appetite, cannot consume the essential truth that mercy, not revenge, is the mainspring of a life well lived